Hello, everybody, and welcome to our sixth webinar. It's the final webinar in our series about animals, climate, and health. My name is Eva Meijer. I am a philosopher, and I am organizing this series together with Katrien Herman and Charlotte Bladner. And I will be hosting today's session. We have three wonderful speakers whom I will introduce later. But because it's the final session, I first want to say something about the other webinars. We began this series with a discussion of COVID-19 and animals. Then we moved to animal testing and alternatives for animal testing. We spoke about animals in crisis and animals in climate change. We actually had two sessions devoted to that. And today we will turn our focus to the future. We will reflect on the insights of the previous sessions, and we will think about ways of moving forward in theory and practice. And we will specifically focus on investigating the connection between animal studies and climate change, but also racial injustice, capitalism, and of course, global health. A note of housekeeping before we start. The first part of our session today will be devoted to a conversation between the speakers that will approximately take 1.5 hours. And after that, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. You can type your questions into the Q&A box during the conversation. And if there are practical issues, we will get back to them during the talks, but we will not respond to the other questions until at the end of the session. So my co-organizers and I will answer everything that you need to know in the chat. So it is now my great honor to introduce the speakers of tonight, three of my most esteemed colleagues, Claire-Jean Kim, Dinesh Wadiwel, and Will Kymlicka. Claire-Jean Kim is a professor of political science and Asian American studies at the University of California, where she teaches classes on comparative race studies and human-animal studies. She is the author of Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, and numerous essays on race and animals. And she is currently finishing a book entitled Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. Dinesh Wadiwel is a senior lecturer in human rights and socio-legal studies at the University of Sydney. He is author of the monograph, The War Against Animals. He is a member of the multi-species research group at the University of Sydney and chair of the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Will Kymlicka is the Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy in the Philosophy Department at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, where he has taught since 1998. He is the co-author with Sue Donaldson of Zoopolis, a political theory of animal rights. Will and Sue are co-conveners of the Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics research group at Queen's. So welcome, my dear colleagues. We spoke about different themes that we want to discuss tonight. And the first thing, of course, that came up was COVID-19. So 2020 was a year of contradiction and crisis. Reflecting on your own work on animals, are you able to offer a short outline of what the COVID-19 crisis highlighted from your perspective? Claire, would you mind answering this question first?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing, Eva and Catherine and Charlotte. So what did the COVID crisis highlight? For me, it highlighted the disparate impact of catastrophic events on differentiated populations. So climate crisis has been telling us this in slow motion, but COVID told it to us more directly and more quickly, that race articulates with capitalism to define populations that matter and populations that don't. And I'm talking about human and animal, populations that are grievable and populations that are not. We know from the figures coming out that COVID in the US has been especially impactful on Black communities, also on Indigenous communities. And so we start with the idea that Black communities are more vulnerable because they have worse health outcomes to begin with, because of poverty, segregation, exposure to environmental toxins. They're more likely to do the kind of low-wage temporary work that puts them in danger of catching COVID. They're more entangled in carceral geographies of various kinds that expose them to COVID. And then once they catch COVID, they're more likely to die from it because they receive worse care because of their Blackness in the US healthcare system. So a Guardian reporter writing about the impact of COVID on Black Chicagoans asked if Blackness should be considered a pre-existing condition when it comes to COVID. So if we look at this convergence over the last year of neoliberal austerity, the carceral system, and finally COVID, so we have capitalist violence, police violence, and epidemiological violence. The convergence of all of those together has sparked a resurgence in Black Lives Matter. The New York Times described it as the largest protest movement in US history, gaining about 15 to 26 million participants and leading to movements around the world against structural anti-Blackness. And then it's no accident that the white nationalist insurrection and attempted coup that happened in DC a few weeks ago came on the heels of that Black-led uprising, because I think the dialectical relationship between the Black freedom struggle and the white supremacist backlash has been a structuring force in US history for a very long time. So you can say in a way there's one planet and we're in this together, but in an important way we're not, and some groups are impacted and carrying a greater burden than others. So when we look at COVID or we look at climate crisis, we have to be reminded that what Fanon called the phobic avoidance or hatred of Blackness is one of the organizing principles of the modern world. And in the same vein, that the Black freedom struggle, as we see with Black Lives Matter, is one of the most capacious and enduring liberation struggles in history. So that's where I see the field of action where animal politics has to situate itself.
Thank you, Claire. Dinesh, do you have something to add to this?
Sure, and thank you for the invite. It's really lovely to be in discussion with you all. I think we'll be talking more about political action, and I definitely agree with Claire that from a social movement or in terms of the political terrain, the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the highlighting of decolonial struggles that has done in terms of a global phenomenon is really important for animal advocates to pay attention to. And it gives us a way to start imagining in different ways how we restructure the world or realize the kind of radical demands that I think animal advocacy always has had. I've been, as you mentioned, I finished a book a few years ago called The War Against Animals, and a lot of that was focused on trying to understand what hierarchical anthropocentrism, and that's, as I'll talk about later, is that anthropocentrism interlaced with ideas around race and race structure, how that anthropocentrism plays out in human-animal relations as a system of domination. But in the midst of writing that book, I became really interested in particularly how does this anthropocentrism relate to capitalism as a force. And one way to think about this in shorthand is the factory farm isn't just a example of human speciesism or anthropocentrism. It is actually about the brutal intersection between anthropocentrism and capitalism. And capitalism in the sense of a system that is designed to endlessly accumulate and draw energies and labor from living beings with the goal of making more profit or more capital. And it does so through a systematic form of overproduction. And to me, that in a way illustrates what happens when that force comes in contact with anthropocentrism. We produce the phenomenon of the factory farm. More relevant to COVID, though, I think what it has also highlighted to me is the way that this system, as we're in a moment where two biological populations have been pushed together, humans and non-humans, how this system produces pandemics continually. And so maybe one way to think about this is it's no news to anybody here that today we kill and use more animals than in any time in human history. And it's not just that as human populations rise, we humans use more animal products. It's that per capita utilization of animals continues to rise. Even though even though it seems like animal advocates are making progress every year, if you look at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization data, humans use more and more animals for food, certainly every year, and that trend continues unabated. What we're witnessing in a way is the radical reshaping of diets that has happened over the last 100 to 150 years. This has, of course, a colonizing impact in that it has radically changed the diets and traditions of many peoples around the world. But it also is about an alteration of the relation between production and consumption of food that has happened over the last 150 years. On the production side, this has meant that animals are more and more ruthlessly pushed into food production to satisfy this demand to overproduce commodities for profit. On the consumption side, what we've seen is that animal products become more and more the means of subsistence for human populations, and it becomes has becoming the norm globally. So even peoples who've largely had plant-based diets are feeling the continual pressure to alter their diets to in line with this massive overproduction of animal-based foods. The biopolitical relation that emerges, though, is one between a massive animal population, which is ruthlessly reproduced, contained and slaughtered for the purpose of human subsistence en masse, and this metabolic relation that has emerged in our midst continually produces pandemics. So scholars such as Rob Wallace have pointed out that capitalist animal agriculture will continue to produce pandemics, and part of this is about that reality of placing large animal populations in intensive facilities and locating these near human populations. But part of that as well is about the expansiveness of the animal agriculture system, deforestation, and bringing human populations in contact with wild animal populations. And these two forces will continually produce pandemics. So COVID-19, in a way, tells us something about the food system that we have. And to me, this is the year has really highlighted what that new relation is about and how this is played out in our everyday lives, and how, in a way, it's one more reminder, along with climate change and everything animal advocates have known about the cruelty of animal agriculture. It's one more reminder of why this system is highly problematic.
Thank you, Dinesh. Will, can I also ask you to say something about COVID?
Sure. Well, from my perspective, one of the most striking features of COVID this year has been to render very visible the state and the role of the state in people's lives. So COVID has created this pandemic, and if we look around the world, those societies that have done better in terms of managing the COVID crisis are those that have reasonably well-functioning public institutions, whether that's a public health care system, public transportation, but more generally, also whether the state has some degree of legitimacy in the eyes of citizens. And so in those societies where state regulations or just public advice about how to deal with COVID, where those are viewed as trustworthy, societies have done better. So the state has played, state capacity and state legitimacy has been important to how societies have responded successfully or unsuccessfully to COVID. And so I think it's an important question for all of us to think about what creates well-functioning public institutions that are seen as legitimate in the eyes of their citizens and that can do the work we need to address this challenge or the many other challenges we face going forward. And so Jennifer Mansbridge, who's a political theorist at Harvard, has this story that the political theory tradition in the United States can be thought of as having kind of two strands. One is what she calls a resistance strand, and it focuses on the question about how individuals and groups can resist illegitimate state power. So the assumption is the state is kind of prone to act badly and unjustly, and the task is to enable individuals and groups to resist the state. But she also talks about this other strand, which she calls the democratic agency strand, which is about the need to get things done. We need the state in order to do things together. And COVID, I think, made clear that sometimes we need the state to get things done, whether that's developing vaccines and administering them, or dealing quickly with having to change our education system, or long-term care for elderly people. So we need to create legitimate state power to get things done. And the title of her paper is "We Need to Get Things Done." And she worries that in the United States, the kind of resistance tradition has taken over. That people, and she's speaking specifically about academics, are interested in and fascinated in how do we empower resistance, and have lost interest in the question about how you create legitimate state power to get things done. And so she thinks we need to rebalance these two traditions. I actually think this is very relevant for the animal case. So I think the animal studies field, we can actually see a similar split, but an even greater imbalance. So at least this is my perception, that there are a lot of people who are very interested in the question of how we can resist the animal industrial complex. And that's both how humans can resist in various forms of civil disobedience and direct action and other kinds of mobilization, but also how animals themselves can participate in resistance. And Dinesh, amongst others, has written really great work on animals as resistance. And we need that. We need to think about resisting state power. But if Mansbridge is right, we also need to think about how we create legitimate state power for animals. Like, I think the interests of animals, if we're ever going to achieve a world that is fair and just for animals, we're going to need to get things done. And we're going to need a state to get those things done. So whether we're talking about a transition from a kind of fossil fuel economy to a green economy, or whether we're talking about replacing our existing system of food production with a plant-based food production, or just whether we're talking about better ways of dealing with zoonotic threats, or whether thinking about better ways of protecting wildlife habitat, all of these are going to require state power, but it needs to be state power that is responsive to the interests of animals. And so I think interspecies justice requires thinking about how we can create an animal-friendly state. I don't see any way we can achieve interspecies justice without creating effective and legitimate state power that serves the interests of animals. And I don't think we have a good theory about what an animal-friendly state would look like. or how we get there. So as in the animal studies, as in the more general political theory tradition, we've got really excellent work on resistance and not so much work on how we might build a legitimate and effective animal-friendly state. And I think that's something that we need to think about collectively.
Well, thank you, Will. So this was a very interesting and wonderful round of answers to the first question. And everybody sort of already said everything about the whole evening. So we can go home now. We had the Black Lives Matter, capitalism, climate crisis, interspecies justice, everything was there. But I am going to try to stick to the themes a little bit. Just very briefly, before we move on to the Black Lives Matter movement and the decolonial movement and new forms of intersectionality, Claire, could I ask you to respond very briefly to what Will and Dinesh said? Or maybe Dinesh, you want to respond to what has been said? Claire?
Dinesh, please take it away. I defer to you.
Look, maybe just in response to Will, I think that's actually a really useful provocation. And I actually quite like the way that you've highlighted this distinction in animal studies. It's only actually something that I'd agree that one area of under-theorization is the relationship of the state to animals. I mean, it actually has been under-theorized, and it's been interesting to note that I think since you and Sue's book, Zoopolis, which did partial theorization of the state, I don't think I've seen anything comprehensive that has dealt with the state as either a friend or an enemy of the kinds of transitions that we need to make. The one comment, I'm a bit unclear about what the role of the state is. And that's because, and this is not news to anybody, and I'm sure Claire may have something to say about this, but that's because the state means different things to different constituents. And certainly we have a strong tradition of social movements where for some social movement actors, the state is always an enemy. The state always acts in complicity with deep domination and violence. And that's a problem. So I think that's a problem that we have to deal with. But I think when I think about what is the relationship of the state to animals, then I can't see much beyond the fact that the state has always acted in a way that has defended hierarchical anthropocentrism. Obviously, there are exceptions, but that to me is a problem that we need to deal with when thinking about the state. I also just make one more comment, which is, and something I think actually I've said to Will a few times when we've met, is that what strikes me about animal advocacy is that it's a highly utopian movement. And utopian, and not in a, I don't mean that in a negative sense, in the sense that animal advocates often are demanding a radical new world, and quite a world that is a massive departure from anything we know. So if we imagine ending human violence towards animals or animal exploitation, we're talking about a completely different world. And I can only compare this sort of movement to very radical left movements or decolonial movements who have similarly imagined completely new worlds. Many of these movements actually had odd relationships with the state, sometimes troubling, but often critical. And so I think that's something that we need to just take into account, is that the demands that we're making far exceed what I can imagine the current state can actually deal with. And that's because the state, certainly where, you know, most nation states that I am familiar with bend over backwards to defend the interests of those who use animals, but they also defend other forms of oppression. So that to me is a tactical problem. And I'm not necessarily making a pronouncement about whether whether these sort of radical futures imagine the state differently or not, I don't know. I mean, that's sort of in that detail I don't know. But I think it's something to think about is, well, what is the role of the state in the kind of aspirations that we have moving forward?
Well, thank you, Dinesh. Will, I'm going to leave the questions of Dinesh to a little bit later in our conversation when we are discussing the interspecies communities. But now, Dinesh, you were also mentioning these radically different worlds that are imagined in the animal liberation movement and animal advocacy movement. And we spoke about Black Lives Matter before. Claire already presented this really eloquently. And a pressing question in all of your work is how animal liberation is connected with other social movements. Dinesh, you already spoke about how Black Lives Matter, how the Black Lives Matter movement also triggered a decolonial movement. Claire, could you perhaps reflect on this a bit more, because you also mentioned these issues.
Just to be clear, are we moving on to the second point? Okay, we are. Okay. So on the question of how animal liberation is connected to other movements, or has been connected to other movements, I think historically we see a very mixed record. So in the early 1800s in the US, for example, looking at historian Diane Beer's work, we know that animal advocates were very involved in other movements like prison reform and the protection of children doing labor, women's rights, abolition. So there was a very much like a synthetic or intersectional approach in the early 1800s in the US to seeing animal liberation as connected to these other forms of liberation. So somehow we go from there to the 1970s, where we have Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. And what's really notable about this book is that it conceives of speciesism in an analogical relationship to racism, right? So speciesism is sort of set up next to racism as sort of something parallel to it. So Singer doesn't look at what the intersection is between the two things or how they're co-constituted, racism and speciesism. He just says, think of speciesism as like another form of racism. So from that point on, animal liberation has really been seen and has seen itself as on this parallel track and to the racial justice movement, and has been sort of seeking recognition as a bona fide movement compared with these other movements. And to me, that approach sort of forecloses an approach where we might theorize the interconstitution of animality, race, gender, sexuality, etc. So coming to animal studies from race studies, I've seen myself as, beholden to ecofeminists from the 1990s, for example, who really were always arguing about the inescapable interconnection between race and species, that these two ideological scaffoldings are co-constituted and have to be dismantled together. And so at this point in my work, I'm really thinking about how to make the argument that animal liberation must be concerned with Black liberation as well, and that the two causes must be seen as inextricably tied rather than as separable at our whim. And I wanted to give a couple of examples why I think it's so important we conceive of the two together. One reason is that if we don't think of animal liberation as connected to Black liberation, then the animal movement invariably ends up compromising racial justice along the way. I could think of a couple of examples. PETA's early 2000s exhibits, traveling exhibits, one of them was called We Are All Animals, and it used pictures of like Black people either being lynched or, in chains. It's sort of images of slavery, racial slavery, as examples or metaphors for what's going on with animals today. Another example, the so-called abolitionist approach in the animal movement, declaring much of this literature declares that the abolition of slavery, the freeing of Black people has already occurred in history. This is a very controversial claim. This is not something that is axiomatic. It's actually very controversial. I would disagree with that statement. So for animal rights to build its ideas about abolition on a false historical premise that Black slavery has already ended I think is really deeply problematic. So another reason why I think animal liberation has to pay attention to Black liberation is, and this is going to go to Will's point about state capacity, is that the moral concern for animals, what I feel alarm about when I look at the political scene today is how the moral concern for animals is being co-opted by the far right and showing up in eco-fascist manifestos. And what the people on the far right do is they tie together ecological issues, racial issues, and animal issues in a way that is persuasive to their followers, right? And nothing on the left or, in the middle, centrist political center has been able to match that ability to bring all of those things together. And so I see animal liberation as an emerging part of a fascist political program. So to go back to Will's point, I agree that we need to think about state capacity in relation to animal rights, but you can have an animal-friendly regime that is fascist. So I think we also have to think not only about how the state will relate to animals, but what kind of state will it be in relation to other issues, right? So, so just to sort of expand on Will's point. Okay, so I think animal liberation has to decide what its racial politics are going to be, or someone else will decide it for them. And we have to ask, is animal liberation going to be at the expense of Black liberation, as it sometimes has been? Will it be co-opted as part of a fascist program? Or will it expand its own vision and see and build upon points of convergence with the Black liberation movement? And then I'll just end by saying, I don't think it's an accident that the two fields that are really at the cutting edge of helping us unravel the Western concept of the human, which has been so damaging, are critical Black studies and critical animal studies.
Thank you, Claire. Will, could you say something about this?
So, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Claire just said. And for those who haven't read it all already, I strongly recommend Claire's book, Dangerous Crossings, which is, I think, still the kind of canonical discussion of how to think about the ways in which racial and species hierarchies energize each other and are interconnected. So I think, that the animal advocacy movement, as Claire says, has a kind of mixed to poor record about how it deals with issues of racial injustice or with other social justice movements, and that was so there was a period of time, as Claire says, particularly with the Singer and Regan kind of corpus, which in retrospect was quite insensitive or blind or narrow in its focus and in the way it framed the issues, as Claire says, mainly in these kind of analogical terms. But my perhaps optimistic sense is that that many people in the animal advocacy movement have started to get the memo, and that there is actually a lot of interest in and commitment to trying to think about these interconnections. So still a lot of work to do, but at least I see progress as compared to where things were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's now I think a very prominent theme. Most, as I see it, many, if not most, of the organizations, conferences, journal issues, and so on have built into their description of their mandate that authors and speakers are encouraged, if not required, to think through some of these intersectional connections. So, but it takes two to tango, and so I think there's an interesting question to think about what's happening on the other side. And so one of the things that is great in Claire's book is a discussion of how the civil rights movement in the U.S. Quite deliberately and in part strategically attached the idea of racial justice to the idea of basically humanism, human exceptionalism, human supremacism. And so the fundamental trope for many people was don't treat us as animals. Recognize our humanity, recognize our human dignity. And human dignity here meaning precisely recognize that we're better than animals. That's one of the kind of canonical formulations of human dignity in the Western philosophical tradition, is to truly respect my human dignity, you need to recognize that I'm better and superior to animals. And so that's true, I think, about many, if not most, social justice movements in the 20th century, is that they have attached themselves to humanism. And humanism in this sense that a central trope is treat us as humans rather than as animals. So it's okay to treat animals as beasts of burden, don't treat humans as beasts of burden. And I'm genuinely curious about whether we see progress on that side of the equation. To what extent are other social justice movements interested in and willing to take up a way of thinking about their interests and their causes and their principles that doesn't rest on this kind of human supremacism? And I'd actually be very curious to know what Claire thinks about that. We can certainly, there are lots of really interesting and exciting intellectual work being done in critical Black studies that's trying to question inherited doctrines of humanism and trying to argue for a conception of racial justice that doesn't just buy these old tropes about human exceptionalism or human supremacism. But I'm just genuinely curious about how people think that transformation is taking place in general advocacy circles, in social justice movements, whether it's labor movements, whether it's migration and refugee movements, whether it's gay and trans movements, as well as indigenous decolonization or African American Black Lives Matter. From where I sit, I still see a lot of human supremacist tropes in the social justice movements, and so I'm uncertain yet about how the sort of intersection that Claire asks us to embark on, how well it's going on the ground.
Claire, do you want to respond to this very briefly? Or shall I ask Dinesh to respond? Please unmute yourself, sorry.
Dinesh, and then I'll respond.
Okay, Dinesh, very briefly, because we're not really running out of time, but we don't.
Sure. No problem. Look, I just wanted to flag that I don't know whether Will and Claire would disagree, that I don't think we should necessarily assume solidarity between the kind of different groups or the different aims that we're assuming. And maybe one way to think about it is that, I mean, there's been a lot of interest traditionally in say Marxist theory, which I've been reading a lot of, in antagonistic relationships or antagonistic social relations. So in the original Marxist story, you know, there's this antagonistic relationship between the worker and the capitalist. We've certainly seen in recent Black studies work a lot of interest in antagonism and a lot of interest in whether, for example, the Black subject has been positioned in an antagonistic relationship with not only the white subject, but the society that attaches to that white subject. And I've been really thinking about this and thinking, are animals also in this fundamentally antagonistic relation with most human social movements in a way that's poses continual challenges to how we imagine change? And one way to think about this is that the bare reality that most humans eat animals immediately places the animal subject in a place of antagonistic relationality, because there's this continual vested interest in subjugation of animals. So I think to me, that's an important question to ask of whether any social movement can potentially ally with the kinds of aspirations of animal advocates, or what human advocates advocate on behalf of animals. That said, I think, and Claire, I think, was heading towards this, there's some really, to me, there's some differences with the way that Black Lives Matter has articulated demands that seem promising on this front and seem really interesting, I think, for animal advocacy. David Pello, a US theorist, makes this point that the demand Black Lives Matter, insofar as it attacks Enlightenment humanism, creates an opening for challenging the kind of anthropocentric hierarchy that that's interlinked with race, which Claire and others have highlighted in their work. And that, to me, I think is just, it's interesting in the sense that the old left movements were premised on a kind of species narcissism. And so if you know, and Will and Claire know this, you know, we read early Marx, there's this very clear hierarchical anthropocentrism that underpins the left project that originates from some of those early writings and continually is in continual reoccurrence in many left social movements. And I think Will talked about this quite distinctly, in that often those social movements go back to the old Enlightenment humanism as a way to ground any social claims. But I think there's something interesting in what is happening to me and what is happening to BLM, with BLM, but the way it has reunited and reconnected with and rearticulated, I guess, a long history of decolonial movement and struggle. That, to me, I think it's interesting for animal advocates to be involved in those conversations and be working towards some of those goals. But I think, as Will hinted, this is just in the kind of knowledge space, and some of it is about debates that are happening in academia and maybe don't relate to what's happening on the ground. But I think thinking about what's happening on the ground, to me, is also interesting. And again, my sense is that animal advocates are demanding something quite radical. They're demanding a reorganization of the world. At a different time in history, it was the traditional left movements that did this sort of work of making these demands. So you often had, for example, I guess in the spotlight of history, you had labour rights movements. You often had tied to these demands for socialism and massive change and restructuring of societies and institutions. But I think today, if we reflect on 2020, the social movements that were making the most radical demands for changing the world, and changing the world in a way that would accord with a vision of justice, were decolonial movements and the Black Lives Matter movement. And to me, that I think is interesting. It's something I think animal advocates have to pay attention to. Just one more point to make is that we often imagine that what it is that there's this group of animal advocates and they've somehow got to get with the program and work with these other social movements. More interesting to me is who the next animal advocates will be and where they'll come from. And to me, more interesting is, will we see animal advocates who, for example, arise from within these new decolonial movements that are happening globally? Will they articulate demands that are completely different because they come from a very different organising base? Will they articulate demands for both racial justice, demands on capitalism and our economic system, but they're tied with demands that relate to non-humans and our natural world? And that, to me, seems really exciting. And that's the kind of debate that I think animal advocates need to be having now, is where are we going in terms of change? And who will be the next animal advocates? Where will they come from?
Thanks, Dinesh. Claire, could you respond to this in 1 or 2 minutes? So that's
1 minute. Okay. So Will, I appreciate your comments, and I really sense the frustration that's out there generally among animal advocates that they have an interest, let's say, in racial justice, and racial justice doesn't seem to have an interest in them. And I hear this over and over, so I really get that frustration is out there. And for one thing, I want to say I agree with you that animal studies has made all of these gestures toward interest in racial justice and gestures toward intersectionality. I don't know that commitment to really thinking about anti-Blackness is very robust, and I base that on my experience with, my interactions in these kinds of events, and so I think we can push that further. I don't think that's sort of hit a wall yet. That it needs to stop there. I do think there's a lot of great work in Black studies. Zakiya Jackson and Af and Silko, for example, Black scholars who are really talking about anti-Blackness and animality and how those two things connect. So, and anti-Blackness and speciesism. The degree to which that's trickled down yet, you ask? Yeah, I'm not sure of that. I do think that that's coming, and I think, we can look forward to that. But I also think engagement, right, with people in another movement, people fighting for another cause. Engagement means being open to mutual change, right? So it means both for animal advocates to say, how do I engage anti-Blackness? How do I think about it? How do I become a critic of it? But also, how can I help people who are committed to ending anti-Blackness to think differently about animals and about humanism and animality? So I see it as a mutual project, engagement as a mutual project. And then finally, I would say that Black Lives Matter, one of the reasons I am so drawn to it as a venue for animal advocates to think about acting within is because, to me, the Black freedom struggle more generally has been the most capacious and the most transformative freedom struggle in world history. So when I look at it that way, I think if we're all trying to move toward ecological justice, we're all trying to move toward, less economic inequality and more gender and sexuality justice, and more racial justice, what has been the movement that has given us the most purchase and has gained the most traction and has been the most inspiring? And it's been, for me, the Black freedom struggle. And how animal advocates react to it, I think, should not just be a matter of like, well, I'm not going to talk to them if they don't want to talk to me. I think it should be about, do animal advocates have an ethical concern about anti-Blackness and all of the ways that it distorts life on this planet? Was that 2 minutes?
It was perfect, Claire. Thank you. So now I'd like to move the conversation to climate change, and I would like to connect that to capitalism and workers, just transitions for workers and animal workers. So COVID-19, of course, came to us in the midst of another long-standing global crisis, which was connected to animal agriculture, anthropogenic climate change. And I would like to ask you to say something about how the events of the last year, but also climate change more generally, has changed the situation for animals, and what kind of global challenges are we speaking about now, and how can we solve them, which is a bit of a big question. Will, could you say something about this?
So I think on the one hand, the argument that animal agriculture is, kind of a central, if not the central, site for dealing with climate change is, I think, sort of finally gaining traction. There was an article recently in The Guardian that said that eating meat is kind of the last socially respectable form of science denial. And I think that's sort of true. Everyone knows the science has proven conclusively that the industrial animal agriculture is at the heart of climate change, and there's no route to dealing with the climate crisis except through dealing with our food production. So that, you know, lots of people have said that when you raised that argument 20 years ago with environmentalists, they tried to shut down the conversation. But it's becoming harder and harder, I think, for people to do that. So I think the question about food production and the shift to plant-based food production is now on the agenda in many different. So it's not just amongst animal advocates. It's now increasingly something that people are thinking about in many government bodies and intergovernmental bodies and social movements and public debate. So that's in a way actually happened a bit quicker than I thought. I given how slow it had been to get traction, how for so many years the issue about eating meat was sidelined in discussions about climate change. It seems to me what's happened in the last few years is actually it's a pretty dramatic change in opening to that issue. Of course, the downside is it's probably not too late. We seem to be on a perhaps a trajectory to global warming that is, and just more generally the catastrophic impacts on wildlife habitat. I mean, there's already so much irreversible damage to the planet and to the animals in it. So I you know, just thinking about how I feel today as compared to 5 years ago, I'm both sort of more optimistic and much more pessimistic. I think we're finally asking a lot of the right questions, but we've lost 5 years or 10 years or 20 years in the meantime, and we're not going to get those back. And the situation is really desperate.
Thank you. Dinesh, could you say something about this?
I'd probably share Will's affect. It's on one hand, I think it's striking in the last 5 years how the language has changed around. I mean, even 5 years ago, most of us felt on the outside of this discourse, and it was very hard to get sensible conversations with environmentalists, for example, about agriculture. But that has changed dramatically. And so on one hand, the terrain has moved and it feels like there's some momentum. The flip side is, as Will says, it's coming too late. And so this is, you know, we're in the midst of crisis and, you know, time is running out to do anything. That said, I think I genuinely believe that crisis is sometimes the opportunity that, you know, it pushes the kind of structural change that you want. And some political change happens incrementally as a result of slow pressure. But as we know, sometimes things change dramatically precisely because of that crisis. COVID-19, I think, was a missed opportunity in that respect, in that we had a genuine social, political, economic crisis, but I don't think progressive political forces were able to seize on the moment. And I think that tells us something, again, going back to this conversation about the success of BLM and decolonial movements globally in 2020 came in stark contrast to, I think, the large failure of other progressive movements or other social movements to advance agendas. In fact, we saw the opposite, of course, and in the US a few weeks ago, where quite frighteningly far-right movements managed to advance their own agenda in quite a violent way. So to me, that seems that, you know, I don't know how to read that. I will say that, again, climate change illustrates the problems with a system that requires deep structural change. How we get there, I don't know. But we are in the midst of an economic system that, by design, will continue to destroy the planet, in my view. So either that requires strong reins by governments to mitigate the worst effects, or it requires a new economic system, and it requires communities to be involved in building what that system actually looks like. The question for me is, where are animal advocates in this discussion? And this highlights that making that point highlights that reliance on a go vegan message is not enough, in my view. Actually, what's required is animal advocates to be involved actively in the conversation on how do we restructure our food system? How do we ensure a reasonable transition for those workers? And in many countries, this is a highly racialized, exploited workforce. But also then the broader question about what does economic justice actually look like? I think animal advocates actually have a very interesting agenda, because this is economic justice that goes beyond the human. This is economic justice that includes non-human animals. And I think we've got a lot to articulate in that debate. But to me, that is one of the big questions. Is we all know that large-scale structural change is required literally to save the planet. I think that's what climate change tells us. Where are animal advocates in that conversation? And to me, that means going well beyond just saying go vegan. It has to be a conversation on what do we want in terms of the world that we're heading towards.
Thanks, Dinesh. Claire, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I want to pick up where Dinesh left off. I found that very useful, Dinesh, what you just said about asking where the animal liberation movement is in relation to some of those issues about structure. So I think the lesson from COVID, if we think about COVID as, like a moment in time, and then climate crisis as unfolding over a longer span, and the lesson from COVID is pretty grim in terms of capitalism. I think what we've seen for the last year is that neoliberal capitalism and the political officials who are beholden to it really have abandoned their populations in terms of taking care and protecting them. They have offloaded the burdens of COVID onto particularly vulnerable populations, racialized populations, the poor, women, animals. And so to go back to Will's point earlier about the state, I think under these extreme conditions, many of us have been forced to surrender. Those of us who still had the fantasy of a political contract between the government and its citizens, of a social contract among citizens or among members of a society, those contracts defining obligations and responsibilities and care, we've been forced to surrender those. And it's hard to imagine going on as usual now and thinking about the state in the way we used to, given what's happened during this year. And so as climate crisis deepens in the coming years, and we see more mass migration and drought and fire and storms, and all of this brings more death and destruction, how bad will things get if we cannot rely on government to protect us, if we cannot rely on social bonds, right, to sustain us? And will we continue on the journey toward fascism, which I believe have begun under Trump? And so I think this is sort of part of the big picture politically. Dinesh is pointing to the big picture economically, and I want to also point to the big picture politically, that I think animal advocates have to consider and to think of themselves as situated within, right, of having to engage that larger politics. Also, I wanted to just make a point about lab-grown meat, because this came to my mind when Will was talking about what's changed in the last 5 years, and there's been a lot of talk lately about lab-grown meat and how this might, if it becomes affordable enough, sort of alleviate the problem of industrial agriculture, animal farming. And I think what worries me about lab-grown meat is the fact that it seems to be an example of how technology and capitalism can save us. It can save us, it can save the planet, it can save us from having to make difficult choices. And to me, that's the wrong message. I think that what we've seen with capitalism is that it is actually the source of the problem, not something that's going to save us. So I'd be interested to know what the rest of you think on that kind of issue. But also, just to close, Will, I thank you for bringing up the matter of things being desperate, because I think I wanted to say something about during the last year, despite my own personal privilege, like just to say something about the trauma people have experienced in the last year and the outrage they feel and the mourning that people are engaged in. And, because we have these polite and I think really productive conversations in academic circles, but there is that sort of reality there as well that I would like to acknowledge.
Well, is there something that you want to say in response to what Claire and Dinesh said?
Well, I don't want to take up too much time. I think this question about whether the idea of a social contract between citizens and the government is a fantasy that we need to surrender is really central. And this so I think we need to so it's hard to, I mean, on the one hand, what 2020 has revealed, as Claire said, is how much that contract has been broken, and how much it was always already broken with respect to particular groups. Indigenous peoples, obviously, racialized populations in many countries. So there's nothing new about there being a broken but in many, I think, movements have had as the goal the building of such a contract, and I think the aspiration to find a way to be able to see the state as one's protector is really powerful, and it came out in COVID. I mean, so you all remember, I'm sure, in Italy at the beginning in March, when Lombardy was the kind of epicenter of the epidemic after it moved from China, all those photos of patients or doctors or nurses who said, "Italy abandoned us." So it was this cry, but it was a cry that was premised on the assumption that Italy should have been there to hold them, to protect them. This is such a deep yearning in many, many people, is to be able to think of their government as having that responsibility for their well-being. And it's obviously, as I say, it's broken. It has always been broken with respect to many groups in society, but it's also a powerful, powerful yearning that I think structures a lot of democratic politics. And I'm not, it's not clear to me what is the alternative other than trying against all the odds to make that not a fantasy, but a reality.
Thank you. Dinesh, do you want to briefly respond to what has been said? No?
I don't know whether, I mean, we could, yeah, I guess I don't disagree with what Will has said. And I think that the pandemic has shown that if you need to get something done, having a state that's legitimate, i.e. that there's a relationship between those who make decisions and the perceived legitimacy by those who have those decisions impact them, that's going to be important. So in that state, literally a state of exception, in that moment where executive power needs to be exercised, having a populace that agrees with the state is going to be valuable. But to me, to unpack what that means for social movements actually is a quite long question. And as Will said, given the history of the state and its relation with different populations, I think it's a hard question to unpack. So just because that reality is there that, for example, in a pandemic or a situation of emergency, having a state actor act effectively with a compliant or consensual population, just because that is there, that doesn't mean necessarily that the aspiration of, say, Indigenous people should be to reconstruct the state, or, you know, I mean, so that to me is actually a quite complex question. That said, I think obviously the goal has to be creating democratic communities that where there's legitimacy in the exercise of power decision making. Now, what that looks like, I don't know, but that to me has to be the goal. So I don't disagree with that.
I'd like to now focus on a sub question of these future democratic communities. Both Dinesh and Will, you've written about animals as workers, animal labor. And I'd like to, before we move to the question of what a just interspecies community would look like, and how we can move to broader interspecies justice, I would like to ask you to say a little bit about animal labor. Will, could you perhaps say something about this?
Well, it's a complicated topic. So in the human case, labor is both the central, one of the, if not the central site of exploitation and oppression. But it's also, for many people, the central site of meaning making. It's how it's central to their identity, to how they understand their contribution to society. I think people have a desire to contribute to society through good, decent work. And so labor is a kind of fundamental to human society. But we've historically tended to not even consider animals as falling under the category of labor. We've exploited them as beasts of burden, but we haven't thought about whether animals too might find in various forms of work. So we know they've suffered the exploitation and oppression side of imposed labor, but we haven't really explored as a society whether there are forms of work that might be good for animals, that might create forms of relationships that they might not otherwise have, forms of self-development that they might not otherwise have, and what forms of just meaningfulness to their lives. You know, it's often said that one of the cruelest things that we do to that animals in zoos suffer is that they just have nothing to do, and they're bored out of their minds, which is why zoos, you know, pump them full of drugs in order to. So I think it's worth asking: are there forms of good work that we could explore together with animals, in order to see from their own actions and choices what they find satisfying and rewarding. So I think this is one of many areas that I think animal politics should be open to exploring together with animals. I think there's just lots of questions about our future relationship with animals that we are not in a position at the moment to know what the answer is. We can only find out by actually exploring these issues together with animals. And so in some of the work that I've done with Sue, we've just considered whether we could imagine, for example, in farmed animal sanctuaries that are committed to a non-oppression, non-exploitation ethic, whether there might be ways of thinking about exploring in a kind of experimental way different possible work activities and work relationships that might be satisfying for animals.
Thank you. Yes, my dogs are exploring their own activities at the moment because it's late and they want to go out. So I've been away opening doors to garden. I'm sorry about this. So this already moves us really into the direction of just interspecies communities. Dinesh, you want to say something about that and perhaps also elaborate a little bit on the importance of animal labor?
I'll just be quick. And I think Will has provided a nice segue to what I want to say, which is surely the goal that we're looking for is the creation of communities that enable flourishing for all members of that community, both human and non-human. And that's a big challenge. Like we've never imagined communities like this. And certainly, like if you look at kind of basic, political theory of like, Aristotle or whatever, that in a sense, the kind of the central part of a lot of the imaginings of communities have largely been antagonistic towards non-humans, and sometimes directly antagonistic towards certain humans, such as slaves and women. So imagining a political space that enables flourishing for all beings actually is a highly radical project. But again, I come back to, I think this is what animal advocates should be aiming for. And it's a big project. In relation to labor, I mean, a lot of my work is really about trying to understand animals under capitalism. And I think to me, the stark reality is that most animals used under capitalism, or most animals used today, exist as a labor force, but a highly exploited, coerced labor force. And I think one thing that I think is interesting in emerging green and left theory has been a focus on the non-human, and the way that capitalism isn't just a relationship between the archetypal human wage labourer and capital, but actually capitalism is a system designed to literally suck energy and life out of every living being. And this has happened both in relation to human workforces. So for example, the fundamental relationship between slavery and the construction of capitalism in creating the resource base for capitalism, continuing forms of forced labour and low wage labour that happens around the world, but also the non-human, nature, animals, and a lot of my work is focused on animals that have been sucked into this economic system to produce value. But I think this ties to the questions about where we want to go. Most of this labour has no bearing or no relationship to the flourishing of individuals. And to me, the one, obviously I'm highly critical of the Marxist tradition, but one of the things I find interesting in that tradition is the question of how is labour or what we do connected to our flourishing, and the justice goal being how do we align our fundamental activity with our own flourishing as beings. And that to me is actually very interesting if we think about animals, in that we've constructed a world where we reproduce animals in their literally now billions, trillions, contain them, slaughter them, and all of this labour has nothing to do with the flourishing of those beings in themselves. So what would it have been to actually create a relation with those beings that is about flourishing? And that to me is a really exciting, but obviously challenging thing to think about.
Thank you. Claire, do you have any thoughts on this? You're still muted, Claire. Sorry.
Can't seem to learn that lesson. So to go back to the point Will raised about labor, animals in labor, animals as laborers. So I started to think about this question when I was reading Vicky Hearn's book, Adam's Task, and also Donna Haraway's books on dogs. And as someone who spent a good amount of time around horses and dogs and cats, I would say I'm open to the argument that dogs like to work in some way, or some dogs like to work, and some horses maybe like to work, but cats really don't like to work. That would be my generalization. But again, like if you look at the horse like, you know, there's some horses that like to jump, they like to go do their quote unquote work with their rider, but the alternative is to stay in a box stall. So I mean, you know what I mean? So it's like, how do you decide what the horse actually wants to do? And I think I would echo Dinesh in saying that, you know, there's on the one hand the question of, is it possible for humans and animals to work together in a way that is non-exploitative? So Will, I think that's one of the questions you were raising. And then Dinesh, you said, but a lot of the ways that we use animal labor is deeply exploitative. And so I think there's the question of what's possible in a theoretical sense and what actually happens most of the time. And my concern is that if we think about animals working as sort of as a possibility to do that in an ethical way, then we're going to describe a lot of the ways that we use animals as enacting that, when in fact the relations are exploitative. And I'm thinking of, for example, you know, therapy dogs, therapy horses, programs where they use horses or other animals in prisons, right, to help rehabilitate prisoners. There are a lot of things that make us feel good about those programs, but I'm quite suspicious of them. And I think, so I guess my answer would just be, how would we stay vigilant to the relations being non-exploitative, even though, you know, we have a strong temptation to describe them as just. So Eva, did you want us to talk more about the interspecies community issue, or did you want to get to that next?
No, if you want to say something about it, please do so now.
So I think I reacted to this question of how do we build interspecies justice by thinking to myself, how do we pursue interspecies justice as an isolated thing? It seems like we're just taking speciesism and excising it arbitrarily from this broader web of violence and domination in which it is situated. So could we have interspecies justice without racial justice? Could we have interspecies justice without ecological justice? So some people might say, if you try to pursue everything, you're not going to get anywhere. And I would say to that, if you try to liberate only one, then you're going to fail ethically and otherwise. So one way to think about this is that book by Anna Charlton and Gary Francione, Animal Rights, the Abolitionist Approach. On the cover, and there's artwork on the cover and the back cover by Sue Coe, whose work I really love. On the front is a picture of abolition. It says abolition, and there's all of these animals in chains, and then there's a black male slave kneeling, and he's in chains, and there's a female black slave. And on the back it says vegan, and all the animals are freed and they're dancing, and the sun's coming up, and there are no black people in the scene. So that was, to me, very dramatic, because it's as if to get to veganism, if we're going to focus only on animal justice, we have to literally erase the question of Black liberation. Why were there not Black people shown as free in the vegan utopia image? And I think one reason is because it's hard to account for how veganism, or animal abolition, as presently understood, is going to accomplish Black liberation. But then, is it really a utopia, this post-abolition vegan world, if you still have Black people in chains, but you've actually gone to the lengths of just erasing them from the picture because you don't want to deal with that? So I guess my larger question would be here, is it possible is it a good idea to think about interspecies justice as an isolated thing? Is that even something that makes sense?
Thank you, Claire. Will, could you perhaps respond to this, and maybe also focus on the role of the state, if that makes sense?
I was going to go on a slightly different direction. I agree completely with what Claire just said, but I might have a supplementary explanation for the art cover. So one of the features of Francione's view is what he means by abolition. Is basically the severing of humans and animals, because he believes, for good historical reasons, that whenever humans are relating to animals, whenever humans are impacting on animals, it's going to be in an instrumentalizing and violent and oppressive way. And so the picture of animal liberation, so he literally, I think, would have trouble imagining that there are humans and animals in the same picture, because I think his vision of justice requires that we actually be quite separate. And which is to say that I don't think he has a vision of interspecies community. His vision of interspecies justice does not require or presuppose, or in my view, even permit interspecies communities. There's no sense of relationships between humans and animals, because he thinks, again, for understandable reasons, that as soon as we claim we're going to relate to animals, we're just going to exploit them. So, so I think one of the questions, I agree with you completely, Claire, that we can't think about interspecies justice apart from other kinds of justice. But I think there is a specific question for the animal community, the animal advocacy community, about whether we believe in the possibility of interspecies community, whether we believe that we can have ongoing relations of dependence and interdependence, and perhaps under some circumstances of friendship or collaboration or cooperation or work, and if so, under what conditions, with which kinds of animals might this kind of interspecies community be possible. And so I think that's actually an unresolved issue in the animal advocacy camp. I think there's actually a kind of long shadow of what Francione calls abolitionism, but which I think should be called extinctionism, which is that we should render domesticated animals extinct, so that the only animals that are left in our utopia are wild animals who we can just leave alone. And so the picture of the animal rights utopia is wild animals who we let be, and humans. So I think there, with many others, I think this is neither feasible, that we could sever relations between humans and animals, nor desirable. But if we are going to have relations with animals, and if we aspire to a kind of interspecies community, then we need to make sure that political power within that community is responsive to all of its members. And so this then goes back to the question about whether we could imagine forms of political community where animals would be members of the political community, they would be members of the public, their interests would count in determining the public good, and that would require reimagining public space. It would reimagining what we mean by membership and citizenship and so on. So this is part of the project that Sue and I are trying to think about, and which I think is here I think there are opportunities as well for connections with other social justice movements, because I think the kind of reimagining we need to do about membership and citizenship, we already need to be doing in any event in order to deal with many different kinds of human social justice movements. We need radically revised and differentiated conceptions of membership to deal with the claims of decolonization, to deal with the claims of racialized minorities, claims of people with disabilities, and so on. And so the project of trying to, as it were, rethink community in the face of radical difference along many different dimensions is, I think, a central task that should bring us together, both animal advocates and people thinking about decolonization and racial justice and so on.
Thank you, Will. Before we move to the questions from the audience, I would like to ask you if you could say something perhaps quite briefly about what the role, because one of the themes in this webinar series has also been the role of the academic as activist, or what is our position in society? How can theory contribute to moving to a better world? And perhaps we can very briefly reflect on that and then go to the questions. Dinesh, could you say something about that?
I'm happy to. I'm probably going to say something negative. I'm not sure about the role of academics, and that's maybe because maybe I have too much of a structural role of understanding of the academy, and certainly where I am, the university is progressively being neoliberalized and pulled into line, if you like, with the rhythms of capitalism, and it seems just performing its core functions of training the next workforce, reproducing dominant ideologies, providing technical expertise to aid forms of oppression and domination, including in animal agriculture. There are obviously voices that emerge from academy that resist all of that, the academy, but I think there's a historical question about where does the kind of thinking happen that challenges oppression and domination, and does it happen always in universities? Actually, I suspect lots of us are inspired by intellectual work that happens outside of universities. So I wouldn't want to say that academics have some special place in all of this. I do think, though, that intellectual work is absolutely required. So coming back to, I guess, what Claire and Will were talking about, the thing that needs to happen is an articulation of the future we want. And that requires intellectual work. It needs to happen both collectively and individually. And it needs to happen in concert with the actors that are going to make the change that we want. And maybe one warning I'd have is that one thing that scares me, particularly in the events of the last 3 weeks in the US, is that the right and reactionary forces actually have a very strong vision about what they want, and it's frightening. So I think that means we can't just say we don't want, we can't just rely on the anti. We need to actually say what it is we want, what kind of society are we trying to build, and bring people along with us. And I think animal advocacy has a particular role, and that's an intellectual role. So a role for intellectuals, whether they are employed in the academy or elsewhere.
Thank you. Claire, do you want to say something about this?
Sure. So I'm going to go in the opposite direction from Dinesh and say academics are the key to everything here. No, I'm just kidding. But I will say I think that people, not academics, but writers, thinkers and writers generally, whether you're in the academy or not, play a crucial role, both in the way that Dinesh was saying about, the vision thing, imagining different relations among humans, between humans and animals, between humans and the earth, and imagining what kind of world we want to bring into being. And, Dinesh has consistently throughout this conversation talked about radical transformation, fundamental transformation, and I really want to echo that and agree with that. I think as animal advocates, we often are thinking, as all advocates do in the real world, we think narrowly because we want to try to get things done, but it's very important to be thinking about the world we want to build because that dictates what we do now and how we get there. So, but I also want to say thinkers and writers have a big role to play. So not just in the future, looking into the future and imagining and fleshing out the vision, but also in helping us to understand, the history of anti-Blackness, the history of speciesism or anthropocentrism, the histories of these movements, the history of the concept, the Enlightenment concept of the human and what kind of work that has done ideologically. And, all of these things are not just automatically self-evident. They are things that we need to be writing about, talking about, debating and teaching. And so I think there's an incredibly important role to play there. And, people who do end up being important activists on the ground, they talk about the educators they had. They talk about what they've read that has influenced them. Go back to the Panthers, for example. They're a very learned bunch. They cited a lot of revolutionary writers and thinkers from all over the world and through history, and not just from the Black freedom struggle, but from outside of it. So I think that we should follow that model as well.
Will, do you have something to add?
No, what Dinesh and Claire said is both great. I just, it's a slightly different question, but perhaps related, which is the balance between, as it were, critique and positive visions for the future. And I think that the animal advocacy movement, has often put a lot of attention on documenting forms of oppression and violence, both statistically but also visually, and just trying to get people to have understand the scale of the violence and oppression that we commit on animals, and that kind of approach persuades many people to care about animals and to do something about it. But I think an effective movement also requires positive visions of what the alternative is. And there, as Dinesh says, I think that's, I mean, and Claire, this is an intellectual task, not necessarily an academic one. And I would say it's not inventing out of whole cloth. We do need to radically transform our existing modes of production and thinking about animals, but there are a lot of examples from around the world, or indeed from within our own borders, of worldviews and traditions that have been much more respectful of animals. And so, one of the things that Sue and I have been thinking about is that in some indigenous cultures in North America, they've thought of their relations with wild animals on the model of a treaty relationship. The treaty is kind of the fundamental structuring basis for good relationships between human communities, but also between humans and animals. And so, I think this is actually an interesting kind of provocation that to think through how concepts like that could be, which have been richly elaborated in many indigenous cultures and works. There's a lot to learn from, and so I think there are examples like that from around the world that require some getting out of our it's kind of in a way on the one hand we're faced with this situation of crisis and emergency and desperation, and so we're often responding immediately to these disasters. But I think we also need to take the time to look much more broadly and to try to think about what we can learn from other societies and cultures over time.
Thank you, Will. These are actually, there were two questions about indigenous knowledge, and I think you answered the first one. The first question was, do you see the movement to recognize indigenous treaties as well as indigenous defined relationship between humans and animals as playing an important role in advancing animal advocacy? And then there was also a second question. I would love to hear the panelists speak to how critical indigenous studies fits in here and what they think about the contributions of native scholars who insist on the mattering of more than human life and imagine decolonial futures. Will, you already said something about this. Dinesh or Claire, do you want to respond to this topic, Dinesh?
Look, absolutely, and I think Will has just expressed some of my view. But there are Indigenous scholars such as Kim Tolbert who've made it very clear that the ideas that many scholars are playing with at the moment around posthumanism and entanglement and all this sort of stuff aren't new. That actually they're part of Indigenous knowledge systems and epistemologies, and it's only as a result of colonial erasure that we imagine that they're new. I also just make another point, which is more pointed, that, and this is, by the way, it's not directed at the comments Will made. I don't think Will has this view, but certainly I think I've seen in other parts of the academy a willingness to take these ideas but not take the political project with it. And this relates to the treaty question, that Indigenous peoples have concrete political demands. So it isn't just that animal advocates can just take their knowledge systems and then, say, oh, this is what Indigenous people believe. There's also political demand for restructuring the world again. So I think we have to engage, animal advocates have to engage with the realities of those political demands. And I think that's where the treaty conversation is important. We shouldn't also imagine in that solidarity is automatic, or that there isn't a lot of work to be done in terms of negotiating shared alliances and ways of moving forward. But that's part and parcel of change, is negotiation between disparate actors towards shared goals. But I do think, again, we shouldn't imagine that. I think Indigenous groups globally are advancing political agendas that are important for animal advocates to be in contact with. And part of that intellectual conversation we've been talking about has to be in concert with all the intellectual energy from Indigenous scholars and leaders who are attempting to both highlight the way that those knowledge systems remain relevant today, but also highlight a political agenda for change.
I just wanted to mention that I was looking through the questions and I saw that one of the questioners is Maria Elena Garcia, one of the questioners on the Indigenous issue, and she's actually an expert on this, and she's doing amazing research on animal liberation issues in Peru. And so she should be on the panel with us. I just wanted to mention that because I saw her on the list.
Thank you. You also want to say something about this topic?
Just a last word about one of the things that I think is most exciting in Canada, where I'm from, is that people are beginning to talk about a kind of Indigenous-led animal advocacy. And so, for example, it was an Indigenous senator who introduced legislation for the protection of marine mammals. And just more generally, there is a strong sense among some Indigenous leaders that that they are able and should take leadership, play a strong leadership role in relation to the animal question. And so I think that's there's been a very difficult, I mean, Dinesh talked about how we can't just automatically take solidarity for granted. The relationship between the animal advocacy movement and Indigenous peoples in Canada has been very fraught since the very beginning, because the first issue that came to the public agenda was the seal hunt, which raised issues about Indigenous hunting. And so that was actually has been a very, very difficult relationship. But I think now, in part because of Indigenous leadership, we're beginning to see what a way forward.
Claire, do you want to respond to this?
Let's go ahead and go on to some other questions, Eva.
There are many questions. I'm looking at them. There is a question about conservation. Hi, many thanks for the conversation. My question is about conservation. It seems to me that it is one of the fields where ecofascism, as Claire was discussing, is more present. It is also one of the fields where academics have more institutional power to affect the lives of wild animals and indirectly domesticated animals. Could you say something about conservation and the future of animal protection in relation to wild animals mostly, I think? Anyone?
Well, I'm not sure. Just a quick comment maybe. the field of conservation is vast, and so lots of different approaches, but there's at least a tendency, let's say, in the conservation literature to be obsessed with the question about the survival of species. And so the kind of bottom line for many conservation people in the conservation field is what's the minimum number of members of the species and the minimum amount of habitat that will safely secure the reproduction of a species. And so, I mean, if you think about it, this is kind of human supremacism in its most blatant form. So humans are permitted to reproduce endlessly and to take over as much of the world as they want. Other animals get the minimum number on the minimum territory. And but if they get the minimum number on the minimum territory, then we think we've got conservation, right? So conservation is in that way, with this obsession about kind of the minimal conditions for a species reproduction, is a very, I mean, we're already failing it massively with the level of species extinction, but it's not a politically adequate basis for just relations with wild animals. And you can meet that bar of ensuring a minimum number of individuals in habitat and be engaging in massive violation of the rights of wild animals and the displacement of their habitats and territories and so on. And so I mean, I think there's room for alliance between animal advocates and environmentalists and conservationists, but it can't be on the basis of that kind of what's minimally required for species reproduction.
Thank you. Will, there's a question specifically for you. The idea of communities containing non-human animals with animal interests represented seems utopian and ahistorical. We see that groups in society only escape exploitation and oppression when they are able to leverage power. Humans will always have the capacity to dominate non-human animals whose capacity for organized resistance is limited. Are you suggesting this power imbalance in order to create non-coercive human-non-human relations? You want to say something about this, Will?
Well, I mean, it's so in one sense, many animals, perhaps most animals, are we have the power to dominate them, and as Dinesh's book shows, this is one perfectly plausible way of reading the history of relations between humans and animals is of war, and our treatment of animals is the spoils of war. So I don't want to in any way minimize the tendency or the track record of humans using their power to dominate. And if someone concludes that we're incapable of having just relations with animals, I can't disprove that. But I think that's giving up too easily. I think we haven't really tried in many cases, but there is, I think, there are many people in society who actually would like to have a different relationship with animals, and I think many people who are willing to try to find a way of relating to animals that allows us all to flourish together. I mean, people's attitudes towards animals are very complicated and mixed, and alongside that impulse to dominate and instrumentalize, there are also instincts towards empathy. There's natural dispositions to care for other beings that often get beaten out of us in our school system, in our education system, and as a result of media and so on. But human beings are not biologically incapable of feeling a sense of deep concern for the well-being of others. And so I think that it's premature to declare failure. The question then becomes an institutional one about how can we create spaces in which we can explore those kind of pro-social feelings that we have and commitments that we have, while limiting and constraining the tendencies towards domination and instrumentalization. And so, as I said before, Sue and I have looked at farmed animal sanctuaries as a site where we could at least begin to ask some of these questions, because it has that kind of mix of commitments and empathetic commitments on the part of the humans who are there, but also some institutional safeguards and oversights and so on. And I just think this is a the future is not written. It's not foreordained. And so I just think we still have so much to learn about what kinds of relationships are possible.
Thank you. Dinesh, do you also want to say something about that? And then also about the question that comes after, which is the question that we'll probably end on. What positive changes do you see as possible to happen in the next 50 years in relation to animals, climate, and racial justice?
Sure. And look, by the way, despite my book, I'm constantly surprised by the opportunities that are around us, and surprised by the relations I observe that counter that trend. And I guess in writing The War Against Animals, I was confronted firstly as a political theorist by the reality that most human relations with most animals involves violence and domination. And I just couldn't get past this. And unfortunately, it's been hard for anybody to show me a counter thesis that's persuasive. The flip side is that by nature, the text was a structuralist analysis, and wrote over all the counter examples that happen on a micro scale often, where we get glimpses of the kinds of relations that might be possible between animals. I'm definitely not in the abolitionist camp, maybe that Will was hinting at before, that suggests that we can't. I actually think, to me, the exciting thing is how do we move forward? And I'm cautiously optimistic, and partly because I see so much willingness for change around me. And I meet advocates who are very passionate about, as I said, the kind of radical transformation of relations and society that we see around us. And that to me is very exciting. I do think, again, my sense is that these sorts of changes happen in moments of deep crisis and contradiction. And we're living in the midst of this at the moment. I look at, my understanding of history suggests we're in for a kind of rocky ride in the next 10 to 20 years. It just feels like there's a convergence of forces occurring at the moment globally that suggests we're going to see big changes. The challenge is, where will animal advocates be in the midst of that? What will we be demanding in the midst of all that? Of course, I worry that, and probably Claire shared some of these worries, that we're going to see the rise of more totalitarian or authoritarian forms of organisation and government. We're going to see, I think, potentially a concentration of economic power that will drive the planet further down the road towards disaster before things will get better. But I also see the opportunities for animal advocates to be part of a conversation about the kind of world we want. And I also see the opportunity for the new social movements that will arise to be placed differently in relation to the old anthropocentric hierarchies. And they're coming back to Black Lives Matter, for example. to me, one of the things that seems really promising is that some of that reliance on the old anthropocentric humanism seems diminished and open to change. And to me, I think that seems really exciting. So I'm also cautiously optimistic, despite, I think, what are pretty tough circumstances we find ourselves in the midst of today.
Thank you. Claire, do you want to say something about this?
Sure. So Dinesh, I feel as though I agree with pretty much everything you said, and yet you're cautiously optimistic and I'm deeply pessimistic. So I'm not sure how we believe the same things, but then come out in such different places. So the question, I think there's a lot of pressure in academic writing and in academic work, like in these kind of conferences, to say something positive at the end, like something encouraging. And so, you know, and I do give into that pressure, but I just want to identify it as something that's at work here. If we look at the next 50 years, I mean, I think what I see as the nightmare scenario and is fairly likely is that as, again, as COVID has sort of given us a preview of, with worsening climate change, we will see more and more instability, war, dislocation of mass populations, and worsening conditions of life around the globe, particularly in some areas that are already struggling more than others, and that will produce political chaos, more of a turn toward authoritarianism and fascism, and that will be a world in which animals, both domesticated and wild, will suffer, and those in between will suffer enormously, and people will develop new, more intense forms of exploiting them and instrumentalizing them and making them suffer. And I think the racial implications of all this are, as I said at the very beginning, already very clear to us how this will break down racially, both in terms of who's affected across the globe more than others and who is affected within a given nation more than others. The alternative route, I think, is not to believe that someone like Biden or someone who is a sort of a Republican light or a neoliberal Democrat, that someone like that is going to dramatically change things. I think the alternative has to be, going back to what Dinesh said, to pursue and think about the possibilities of radical, fundamental, transformative change that will address both the plight of animals and the plight of racially oppressed peoples and the state of the climate and the planet, and our ecological health. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to go in that direction or that something will be realized that's never been realized before. But I go back to Derek Bell's idea about racial realism, and you're fairly certain as you move forward that what you're doing is not going to make a difference, that what people are doing is not going to necessarily end up where you want it to, but you still do it because that's, you have to fight the good fight. So.
Thank you, Claire. Maybe as a final question, we have 5 more minutes. The person who was asking the question is interested about the role of animal rights-based political parties who advocate for economic, environmental, social, and racial justice alongside animal rights. Is this the place where the potential of the state to take a transformative stand against ecological and socially oppression is realized? And this sort of connects perhaps some of the points that we've been discussing, the pessimistic views and the optimistic views.
Yeah, to comment on that, because I feel you would have a lot of knowledge with which to answer that question in terms of your understanding of Europe and some of the parties there.
Yeah, in the Netherlands, we actually have quite a strong animal party, the Partij voor de Dieren, Party for the Animals, that is growing a lot, and that is, I think, propagating a new type of institutional politics that is hopeful, and that really they're really aware of the questions that we've been discussing tonight. And I think that because they are functioning in an institution in a system that is actually capable of making change, there is value in that, in addition to social justice movement. So I think that many of the things you spoke about in relation to Black Lives Matter and their critique of humanist ideologies can also be found in the work of the Party for the Animals. And I wrote an article about that, but it's under review. So we'll get back to that at some other point probably. But I do think that there is some reason for hope in existing politics with these parties, but it's very different in different countries. So there's not one animal party, I think, and I don't think they're very successful in other countries as well, or at least not as successful as in the Netherlands. So yeah. Does anyone else want to say something about animal parties? Will?
Well, just a more general comment about political parties generally. So lots of people no longer believe in political parties, and membership in political parties has generally declined across most of the Western democracies, and so maybe the era of political parties as important vehicles for change is receding, but at least until today, and up to and including today, political parties are in fact the fundamental vehicle for legislative change. If you want to get legislative change, you need to get it into the platform of a political party. Political parties are, as it were, the filters that determine what kinds of legislation gets onto the agenda. And so I think it's actually a very interesting and important question. If one believes at all in existing conceptions of democracy, how should the animal advocacy movement relate to political parties, and which political parties do we think might be promising champions of? So the Dutch case it's a very specific one, in part because of the electoral system, but Kim Stallwood, who's a long-standing animal advocate in both Britain and the United States, has said that he views this as one of the greatest failings of the animal advocacy movement, is that there's never been an actual strategy for how to relate to political parties. I think in some countries, animal parties are actually a really promising vehicle. In other countries, because of the electoral system, they don't really have much of a chance, and so we need to think about what are the alternatives. Just political parties are central. They have been central to the life of Western democracies. We have political party-based democracy, for better or worse, and so I think it's a really interesting strategic question. How do we think about our relationship with political parties?
Are there any final, thank you, Will. Are there any final thoughts, questions, things that you want to say or add? No? Well, thank you very much, Claire, Dinesh, and Will, for this wonderful, and I hope for the audience also inspiring conversation. This was our last webinar. Katrien, Charlotte, and I are planning to organize a follow-up in the form of a conference in which we will discuss animal parties and focus on the transition from our current society to a more just interspecies or whatever it will be society. And if you want to stay posted, you can follow us on social media or go to our website, animalsclimatehealth.com. The recording of this session will also be available on the website. Katrien, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody. It was an amazing panel once again. And thanks for all the interest in our webinar series. We were really happy to see how much interest there is in the nexus of climate change, animals, and global health. And as Eva already said, we are definitely planning future actions. And one thing is that we are going to plan a conference. And yeah, we don't know yet when, probably by the end of this year. And we will keep you informed via our website. Thank you to all our amazing panelists and to the attendees. And yeah, I hope to see you all again. Thank you.